Everyone, welcome to Life Edge, because life should not be mediocre. It's much too short to be mediocre. I am joined today by Dr. Susan Nash. Dr. Susan, how are you?
Good. And you probably hear a bird outside. It sounds like a bird in distress, but I think it's a bird protecting its little broodlets.
That's cool. Sounds like a cool bird. And today we've got Harold. Harold is our video producer today, and we've got our favorite economist. Dr. Ed Stuart is back, and here we go.
This show is sponsored by Relate Corporation. Digital learning development, media development, corporate video, management consulting, and more. Visit us at www.relate.com. Thanks.
And back in our center position of power, it's Dr. Ed Stuart. How you doing, Ed?
Hi, Rick. How are you? Hello, Susan. Nice to see you all again.
We are good and happy to have you on board. Like I told you pre-show, we've been worried about you with all the stuff going on in Chicago. You got deaths. You got death toll is much higher than it's ever been. Everybody's just shooting each other and having all sorts of fun. And but you told us you're safe, you're well, and you run. So this is good.
Yes, in pretty good health. And actually, the weather in Chicago has been ideal. It's about 80 degrees and 30% humidity, a gentle
nice
wind for the past several weeks and for the next several weeks. So except for, an occasional shooting and looting, we're living in paradise here. Yeah.
That sounds nice. Are you overlooking the lake where you are?
Yes. Yeah, I look at Lake Michigan and I look at the Lincoln Park Zoo.
That sounds nice.
That's amazing. So, last time we talked, we were at a different stage in the pandemic, and now, some of the supply chain issues seem to be more or less permanent. Some of the supply chain issues are getting worked around, but this is hanging on so much longer than anybody expected.
What's an election here?
What do you think that means in terms of economic outlook?
Like the expansion of the U.S. economy is going to be, kind of like what we talked about last time. It's going to be slower and more kind of spread out and longer to revive in general, although like most things in the U.S., the average hides a multiple of extremes. There are certain parts of the economy that I don't think are ever going to come back to where they have been, and there are certain parts of the economy that are better now. I think, I'm sure you might have noticed that today Target, or as we used to say in Norman, Oklahoma, Target, has reported one of the best quarters they've ever had, and so, and Walmart as well. So they're benefiting from being good marketers and having relatively low price points. But also, I think they benefited from the pandemic because Target and Walmart stores were allowed to stay open because they sold groceries, as opposed to Sears and whatever, all the other ones that have had to declare bankruptcy. And what Rick does in e-learning and e-consulting, I think that's a boom industry. Last night, I had dinner with one of my very, very bright former students. She was in commercial real estate, and she's just started this week working for a company called Gorilla, which does e-commerce consulting. Their headquarters are in San Francisco, but they've got offices really all over the world. So the area of communication and communication infrastructure and that, I think, is, that's one of the things that's driving the stock market, and my stock market letter, for what it's worth, Susan, is I wouldn't buy airlines, I wouldn't buy cruise ships, I wouldn't buy hotels, I wouldn't buy commercial real estate, I wouldn't buy old automobile companies, and I wouldn't buy anything that has to do with carbon-based energy production or transmission or sales. And I would buy any kind of technology or communication, and yeah.
Well, in that case, I'm not sure if I completely agree.
Whatever smart retail is.
Oh, right. Well, so here's a thought. Right now, we're looking at collapsing oil industry, especially shale players. Nevertheless, gas is used to generate electricity, and the demand for electricity is booming, and there's not really the critical infrastructure for electrifying the entire country with like high tension grid across the country. So I really think that in 18 to 24 months, we're going to see a boom in natural gas prices again, as that's needed to fire the electricity, to generate electricity. And as we can't keep up with solar and hydro and geothermal and other alternative sources, wind power.
Okay, I'm going to make a bet with you, Susan, because I'm going to bet just the opposite, right?
Okay.
And whoever wins the bet has to pay for dinner somewhere that it costs at least $200 for the two of us. Because I think natural gas and oil prices are just going to keep going down, and they're going to get replaced sooner or later by green energy in whatever form, hydroelectric, which is still fairly plentiful, and there are more supplies of natural gas. They've just, the Turks and the Cypriots and the Greeks are about to fight over a huge natural gas field in the Eastern Mediterranean. So,
yep.
Yeah.
That's going to be interesting. I heard the Greeks are building ships like crazy to try to fight them. That's going to be interesting.
Yeah. And hopefully they'll be bearing gifts. And you know what to say about Greeks bearing gifts. So
that's right. Anyway, that's interesting. Now, we were going to talk also a little bit today about Marxist economies, a little bit about what Russia went through and actually what China went through and is going through. People think China's really strong right now. I disagree. China's kind of a house of cards, because if they collapse us, guess who also collapses? They do. They kind of forget that part. But what is the big difference between a Marxist quote-unquote economy or a communist economy and an economy like ours, which is quasi-capitalist?
Well, you have brilliant timing, Rick, because what I've been watching the last few days is, of course, what's going on in Belarus, because there you have the last real Soviet economy, right?
Oh, they still have it? They still have a Soviet economy?
Yes, right.
Interesting.
And the current president, Mr. Lukashenko, has been there since '94, was a collective farm administrator when Belarus was one of the 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union. Now, I have not been to Belarus. I've been to the Ukraine. I've been to other parts of the former Soviet Union, but I haven't been to Minsk or other places. But and I'm sorry that I probably won't get to go before it starts to change. But it is a real Soviet economy in that there's almost no private sector. What's probably what seems to be tipping Mr. Lukashenko's power and why he's probably on the way out is that his base of support, and I love these names, the Minsk tractor factory and the Minsk automobile factory, the workers there who were relatively privileged, and the emphasis is on the word relatively, they booed him when he went to ask for their support. And so what we're going to see again is what we saw in the former Soviet Union in 91, what we saw in Eastern Europe and the Ukraine and East Germany in 89, and what we began to see in China in 78 is a dismantling of this economy. But to answer your question, a real Soviet economy has nothing but public ownership. So the government in Belarus owns everything, right? One of the quote advantages of the Belarus situation right now is that unlike the Putin government, there are no oligarchs in Belarus because there's nothing to own, right? So the power structure in Belarus right now is like the power structure back in the old days of the Soviet Union. It was just 6 or 7 really old guys who'd been there for a long time. And they had nicer houses and they had bigger cars and they had better doctors, but they didn't have yachts. They didn't have mansions. They don't have mansions on the Riviera. They don't have chateaus in France or whatever. And so when the Lukashenko government goes there, it should be an easier transition. Now, to go back to Susan's point about supply chains, their supply chain right now is to Russia, right? And it's not the most efficient, and it's probably not the best, but it's set up for transition. Now, one of the other advantages that Belarus has that the Soviet Union had. And I always got in trouble in my American universities for saying good things about the Soviet Union. But one of the few good things about the Soviet Union is that they had a really good elementary and secondary educational system. They had very well-educated mathematicians and scientists. And in Belarus, they're actually government-sponsored software development industrial parks. And so they're relatively well-educated people. That's one of Mr. Lukashenko's. It's the problem with every authoritarian country is that when you start educating everybody, they suddenly want other things than just to be told what to do. There's another democratic revolution going on in Thailand right now. There are students revolting in Bangkok, and it's mainly an internet and YouTube revolt right now, but they're disrespecting the king, right? Which is not something you do in Thailand. So Mr. Lukashenko's problem in Belarus, just like Mr. Gorbachev's problem and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's problem, was that if you have a bunch of educated people, and these days the educated people can communicate with educated people all over the world, and they know that there's something better out there and something different. And in the case of Belarus, the something different is not that far away in Poland and in the Czech Republic and Slovakia and in the Baltics, like we were talking about before we went on, that Skype came out of Estonia, and actually one of the leaders of the opposition in Belarus, a woman who has fled, and she's right now in Lithuania, and Lithuania is another border country with Belarus, and not that far away. So it's kind of the opposite of what you asked, Rick. It's kind of an un-Marxist revolution going on in Belarus, because instead of what the Lenin and Stalin did in the Soviet Union, whereas they took everything that was private property and turned it into public property, what's going to happen in Belarus is just the opposite now. They're going to take everything that was public property, and a lot of it's going to be private property.
Interesting. Now, go ahead, Susan.
Oh, sorry. Well, so here's a question. So our education system has been in trouble, and we are constantly sort of reminded of how our primary and secondary education is failing us. So conversely, does it make it easier to convince people that Marxism works?
Yeah, maybe. Although I don't think, aside from a few professors at various universities, I won't mention any, but I don't see that as a real Marxism in the sense of let's turn everything into Maoist China or Stalinist Russia or East Germany. I don't see that anywhere among my students. It's more, if you say Marxism is economic radicalism, the kind of radicalism on campuses today is much more cultural radicalism about what you call things and what you call people and whatever. I don't think you can find large groups of college students or young people who want to go back to the Minsk, who think the Minsk tractor factory is the ideal solution to the world's problems.
No, this is more of a almost technocrat, bureaucrat, newspeak revolution.
Yeah, right. It's more of a revolution of language and labels, right? It's Rick. When I got elected to be the chairman, but I couldn't call myself the chairman of the economics department. I had to call myself the chair. And I kept insisting to people that I was not a piece of furniture, that I might have a wooden personality, but that's carrying it a bit too far. But yeah, it's that kind of a revolution, and I'm an old white guy, so I say it's just a waste of time, and it always I had a very establishment maternal grandfather. He was an attorney. Right? And he hated euphemisms of all kind. And one of my favorite sayings of Grandpa was he used to say, "I am not a senior citizen, I am an old man." Right? And so, yeah.
Well,
take that what it's worth. So I'm an old man. I'm not a senior citizen or a golden ager or a whatever.
Well, it's sort of funny watching some of the current quote-unquote radicals or anarchists or whatever they are. When they talk, they're fairly stupid. They don't seem to know much of anything. And they all of a sudden went, "Oh, hey, we don't like Bezos. Bezos just made $30 billion. We want to kill him." And he's just going... And this is an interview I was watching on TV once, and it's like, really? Okay. And they're the ones who put a guillotine in front of his new house being built in Washington, D.C., I think. And you just go, oh, smart. This is a good group. They have no idea what's going on. They just come up with something and go, yeah, let's kill those guys now. Okay.
And I think that's the problem, the inherent problem in the Democratic Party is that most of their votes have to come from union guys and union gals and ex-union guys and ex-union gals. And there, I would make the argument that Jeff Bezos has too much money, and one of the ways to kind of redistribute is to make all of his Amazon workers members of a union with better wages, and that's how you do that. A guillotine isn't gonna change that, or labeling him something. Yeah. But that's harder. It's harder to make that kind of argument, and it's also harder to do. How do you change labor laws? How do you change union organizing procedures, and how do you convince people that work for Amazon that union representation may be a better way to redistribute income, which needs to be redistributed.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's just for it, if anything, to be able to fund additional innovation and pods, and not just have them all feed into the same feudalistic techno. I think it's more like Neofeudalism. I remember years ago there was a book called Microserfs, and they were talking about working at
Say
Microsoft.
That again, Susan.
That
Susan, what was the name of the book?
Microserf.
Microserf. SERF, right?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I wasn't talking about little tiny surf guys in California. Surfer, it was SERF, right?
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
They're the ones who use the shorter boards. That's all.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's funny.
Well, I mean, it does seem almost like we're in a techno-feudalism.
Well, you were talking right at the beginning of how much money Target has made or Target has made, and Walmart. The worth of Apple just reached $2 trillion.
Yes.
My gosh, that's amazing.
And that's not that old, right?
No,
I'm much older than you are, Rick, and Susan is still in her teens. But I can remember when Steve and Steve were in their garage in Cupertino, California, and Apple was just some kind of crazy thing that came out of California, like all crazy things that always come out of California. And the head of IBM was making the prediction that in several years there would only be 3 computers in the world because computers were just going to get bigger and bigger and more powerful, and that's all the computers you would need. And turns out that kind of Soviet type thinking, where you want to get bigger and bigger and bigger and have a very few people in control of something, turned out to be not the right answer, or not the way forward.
And it's funny because IBM hated that fact so much that even though they had one of the most successful PC divisions, they sold it. They sold it to the Chinese as Lenovo, and you just go, why did you do that? Those laptops were making a lot of money for IBM. No, they decided they didn't care. Odd thing. But IBM's a little bit odd.
Now, speaking of Lenovo, Rick, I'm going to disagree a little bit with you on the China thing. I think there's parts of China that will implode or explode. The Uyghurs in northwestern China, the Tibetans in the south, some of the poor rural in the interior. I think there's going to be political unrest, social unrest, cultural unrest somewhere fairly soon.
Yeah.
I keep expecting in places like Shanghai and Beijing and Chengdu what's going on in Belarus right now. But I don't know when that's going to happen, because there is a relatively large part of the Chinese economy that's pretty impressive. And although I should say, Rick, that I should do truth in advertising, that the only stock that I own outright is Starbucks, and the health of Starbucks depends almost more on China than it does the United States, because there are more Starbucks in China than there are in the U.S. And I've been to a couple of Starbucks in Beijing, and they're quite spectacular. That reminds me, Rick, we were talking about shopping centers before. Big shopping centers in Beijing, luxury shopping centers.
Beautiful ones.
Have beautiful, architectural masterpieces that have quite impressive Starbucks, and the coffee that comes out of them looks just like the coffee that comes out of my Starbucks here in Lincoln Park. So I think you're right, Rick, in the sense that the Chinese political economy as it exists today is not stable. It's not, as we would say in economics, it's not a stable equilibrium. Right?
No.
There are centrifugal forces that will pull it apart or shake it somehow. But I don't know when that will happen. It might not happen for another 10, 15, or 20 years, or it might happen in 6 months.
Sure.
Right?
Now, how capitalistic is China versus communistic in terms of their finances right now?
Yeah, that's a great topic. We could do a whole semester on that.
I can imagine.
Absolutely.
About 80% of their GDP comes from what you would normally say is the private sector, from Alibaba and Lenovo and Tencent and whatever, Huawei and Xiaomi and all of those. The problem is that if you're an owner of Alibaba or Lenovo, the government can take it away from you tomorrow.
Right. There's always that insecurity.
Unlike owning my share of Starbucks, I don't think the U.S. government's going to come and take away my shares of Starbucks, or Howard Schultz's, more importantly, because he's got a lot more shares than I do. There's nothing they can do to change the private property rights of capitalists in the U.S., whereas the Chinese government can, which is why San Francisco real estate prices, Vancouver real estate prices, Seattle real estate prices, even Chicago real estate prices have something of a demand floor under them from Chinese purchasers, right?
Yeah.
And not necessarily because the Chinese want to live there necessarily, but it's a way to get some of their money out of China and to have a place to land if something happens.
But here's a big question. Okay, so we're seeing kind of challenging issues with respect to manufacturing, and it's the time has passed when creating 1 million widgets and just warehousing them and eventually selling them really works. We're seeing more and more print on demand or manufacture on demand. And that can be done here in the U.S., can be done there, but the main issue tends to be logistics in the shipping and getting them here. And as long as there's a pandemic and also issues with customs or ports, that's going to create bottlenecks, which really tends to hurt Chinese manufacturing. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
And actually will hurt U.S. manufacturing, right? Because lots of what goes into U.S. manufacturing comes from outside, right? So when the Trump administration put tariffs on steel, right, there are 80 workers. For every 1 worker in the U.S. that produces steel, there are 80 workers that use it, right? Yeah. So yes, we can bring all manufacturing back to the U.S. And I'm looking at my New Balance tennis shoes over here that cost $90. And when we bring that manufacturing back to the U.S., they'll cost $450, right?
Well, I thought New Balance, I thought, is made mostly in the U.S. They assemble some few foreign.
They're made in Vietnam now.
Are they really?
Right?
Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I love New Balance.
There are no athletic shoes of any kind made in the United States.
Okay.
And they used to be made in China, but now that China's gotten too expensive to make shoes, that's shifted to Vietnam and Thailand, and maybe Central America and South America. Yeah. So, and if manufacturing comes back to the United States, as we would say in Oklahoma, it ain't going to be done by folks. It's going to be done by a machine, right? Adidas is bringing back some shoe manufacturing to Germany, but the factories in Germany that Adidas are building have 0 workers, right? They have a couple of programmers and some security guards, but they've got no manufacturing employees whatsoever. It's all automatic manufacturing, all not computer-aided manufacturing, but computer manufacturing. Right?
Well, you can see that in the new shoes. I bought some new. Sorry, you can see that in the. Sorry, there's a lag, but in the shoes from Vietnam, I just bought some new Asics, and in the past, the pieces were sewn together. Now it's clearly just one extruded or 3D printed piece of the upper is one solid piece of basically plastic that's attached to the rest.
I get to show off my Jesuit education. Do you know where the name Asics comes from?
No.
Asics Asics is a brand created by the Onitsuka Shoe Company from Japan. But when they were first coming to the United States in the 1960s, there was still some anti-Japanese hostility, so they didn't want to brand themselves as Onitsuka. So they took the Latin phrase of Aristotle's a healthy mind and a healthy body, which is anima sana in corpore sano, and that abbreviation is Asics.
Asics.
So
yep.
That's where it comes from.
Interesting.
Right? So it's a Japanese company, right? And that's how Bowerman and Phil Knight in Oregon decided to change the name of their little shoe company, which they started as Bluebird or something like that. They said we need a more mythical kind of name, so let's name our shoe company after the Greek goddess of victory, which of course is Nike, and that's where they got that name. So that's my argument for why the Jesuits should keep teaching Latin, like they forced me to take. But we're not teaching it anymore, Susan. To go back to your declining standards of American education. You know, Rick, in the old days, public schools throughout the United States taught Latin. That was part of their standard curriculum.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
I took 3 years.
I avoided it.
Yeah.
I went to Catholic school up to elementary school, which was 8th grade in New York, and then went to public school, T.A. Edison High in New York, and I took French. I didn't take Latin. It was available, but I decided it's a dead language. I'm going to move on to French. And then when I went to school here in L.A., they actually offered Latin too in high school. Again, I continued with French, and I took Japanese. So that's kind of how I was going. And I took Japanese and Chinese for 2 years each, and it was fascinating in those days. I was thinking of going into the diplomatic corps, and then I said, I don't think I can lie for a living. Okay, I'm done. I'll go somewhere else. So
you can't smile when people are insulting you.
That's right. Yeah.
No, that's why I couldn't go into sales or anything like that, because my face would just say, "No, you don't really want to buy this. This is not very good," or whatever. Yeah.
Also,
speaking of radicals, I think that's one of the bad things that radicals of my generation did, which was to force the elimination of most requirements, including foreign language and math.
Yeah, it's a shame. Yeah.
There's just a certain and Western history and all those things that you need to take to be an educated person. So I would quibble with your statement that American students aren't very bright. I would just drop out the word students and say Americans aren't very bright.
Okay, fair enough.
They're bright. They're just not very well educated.
Right. That's true. And common sense is slightly fading, but there's still enough of it out there.
Yeah. I think common sense comes out of education, that you kind of learn a little bit. I mean, a little bit of mathematics helps common sense. A little bit of history helps common sense. A little bit of, science helps common sense, right?
Well, you know what they don't do in school anymore that much, whether it's elementary, high school, or college? Critical thinking. Just breaking things down, analyzing them. Why is this good? Why is it bad? Did you hear what somebody asked Trump yesterday? It was actually rather funny.
We got frozen.
Oh. Are we okay? Can you hear me?
I think we're okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Susan, can you hear me?
Yeah, no problem here.
Okay. Well, yesterday somebody asked Trump, one of the reporters, is it true that you're going after child trafficking and what was the other one? Trolls or some sort of pirates or something. It was like, and he goes, what? Cannibals. And he goes, well, I hadn't heard of that, but I guess it wouldn't be a bad thing if I were, right? He goes, we are going after people who are violating laws and hurting children, yes. But it was just, his expression was like, I guess it had to do with, I really haven't read much about this, the Q or QAnon experience, whatever that is. I know very little about it, but I guess that's where that came
those
from.
People here in Illinois, but I think they're in California, and I don't know where else they are. But.
Oh, I'm sure they're here. Everybody's here. So,
yeah, right.
every
yeah,
group
California, you're a big country. Yeah.
We are a big country. 40 million of us. Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah.
Half of them even don't come from here, so hard to say. Mm-hmm. But I thought that was a funny question to ask him, and then his response was even funnier. Well, is that a bad thing? I guess. The reporter had no idea what that meant. She just started staring at him. It's a little odd. Anyway, we are just about out of time. We started a little bit late, but we kind of caught up in flight.
It's interesting how time flies when we get going. So when I win this bet, Susan, and the price of natural gas and oil is below $40 in 2 years, we'll have to invite Rick, right? But we'll have to schedule at least 4 hours for dinner. And yes,
I'm in. Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. I have just the French restaurant in Chicago that I'm going to make you take me to, right?
Well, okay. But I will you win.
Anyway, and as always, a pleasure having you on. We have to have you on again soon because we're always touching on things. We never get super deep into it because there's so much to talk about. So we'll have you back.
Times. Yes.
Yeah. And,
definitely.
And by the way, Susan, there's no more pandemic. That's already been called over. We're the only ones still talking about it still going on. But if you listen to the World Health Organization, the guy said the pandemic is over. You must wear your masks for solidarity. Solidarity. Try figuring that one out.
Well, they were wearing masks at the Wuhan outdoor
They started
water
that.
park.
Yeah, I know. Something's going on. Yeah. Anyway, maybe one day this will be over, I hope. Well, you heard what the Democrats said recently. You know, after November, if the voting goes well, it'll all be over. So, okay, what does that mean? We don't know. So anyway, we'll have a good one, Ed. You too, Susan. And for all you folks watching, we'll see you next week on Life Edge. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you. Good to see you, Susan.
Good to see you.